This is episode 278 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am pleased to be joined this week by Jerry Walker. He is the president and CEO of the Independent Community Bankers Association of New Mexico. We'll especially be talking about legislation in the New Mexico legislature that would create a public bank. It's HB 236, the New Mexico Public Banking Act. But before we get into that, welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Jerry.
Paul, good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
Hey, no, it's great to hear your perspective, and I look forward to talking with you about both your organization as well as this particular issue in the legislature. But before we get down that track, what is the Independent Community Bankers Association of New Mexico? What does your trade association do?
Well, Paul, ICBA New Mexico was formed in 1984. It was a direct result of the effort to bring interstate banking to New Mexico. The home-owned banks at that time, and at that time there were somewhere along about 90 or so banks that were home-owned banks here in New Mexico. They were not necessarily real fond of the idea of the large regional and national banks coming in to the state, and so that's when the association was formed. I came on the scene with ICBA as a contract lobbyist, actually, in about 1986, 87. And for about 5 years or so, I lobbied against interstate banking, myself and quite a few other folks. Eventually, interstate banking was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. And so I left the contract lobbying world for a while and actually ran ACI in Albuquerque for several years, about just under 5 years. And at that point, the leadership of ICBA New Mexico decided that the association needed to have a full-time presence. And so they contacted me and asked if I would come aboard as their first paid executive, if you will. And so I did. And I've been with the association now 25 years, just finished 25 years. And I actually will be retiring at the end of this year. The association exists primarily to help home-owned New Mexico headquartered banks to be competitive in the marketplace with not only the large regional and national banks, but also competing with nonprofit entities such as credit bureaus and with government service enterprises, GSEs, such as the Farm Credit, such as there's a number of entities out there that compete with community banks in the marketplace. So that's the first thing we do, is try to help our banks remain competitive. We provide most of the education for bankers in New Mexico. We have education events going on just about 11 months out of 12 every year. We also our claim to, not claim to fame, but our primary purpose is to defend the dual chartering system, the dual banking system. And what that means is there's you can start a bank two different ways. One with a state charter going through the FID, the Financial Institutions Division in Santa Fe, and actually charter a bank through utilizing state statutes. Or you can go to a national charter, a federal charter, and charter through the federal government. We think it's very important for there to be choice for bankers and those who would be getting into the business of banking to have a choice as to whether or not they charter nationally or locally as a state bank. And so we try very, very hard to defend and protect the right of choice for the dual chartering system. And finally, of course, our mission is to help our banks maintain the value of their stock, the value of their charter. We are a for-profit, we represent for-profit entities Banks uh, are there to make money for their investors, their stockholders, and to do it in a free market and in a competitive marketplace. So those are the things that we try to do. Paul, I will tell you that over the last 25 years, the year that the board actually made the offer for me to come on board and become their first full-time executive, we had 64 banks at that time, uh, chartered, headquartered here in New Mexico. Today, today, 33 banks. And so one of the things that's happened over the years is exactly what our industry cautioned the legislature about back in the early 80s when we were fighting interstate banking. And that was that the big banks really were not coming in here to do business here as much as they were wanting to come in, buy local banks and capture those deposits and deploy those deposits out of state where maybe the economy is better, where the loan demand is better. And so we've seen a tremendous drop in the number of home-owned, home-operated, headquartered banks in New Mexico. And that's something that concerns all of us and should concern everyone in the state.
Well, that was a, very thorough and detailed explanation. You can tell you've been doing your job for quite a long time, and they will have big shoes to fill when you do head off into the sunset there. Excellent explanation of the importance of your industry. Before we do move on to the Public Banking Act, though, uh, talk about the difference between your members and, say, Bank of America functionally in New Mexico, and also maybe any challenges associated with New Mexico in doing business here for your members. You know, Texas and a lot of other states. I'm not just picking Texas, but a lot of places have much more strong, small business driven, thriving economies than New Mexico. We do rely on oil and gas, and I don't know if that industry plays a significant role in uh, what you're doing or not, but we also have a lot of federal government dollars that flow in here. So kind of expound a little bit upon those two parallel issues.
Sure. Well, quite honestly, the difference between the large national or regional banks and our members here in New Mexico, uh, the larger banks are basically transactional driven businesses. Um, and this is true, or most people would know this is true if they bank with one of those entities and they have to call an 800 number and the person on the other end doesn't know who you are. They just need an account number or a social security number or some identification number so that they can try to assist you with what it is you need. On the other hand, our banks, we're relationship driven. Our bankers and our banks know their communities. Our bankers know their customers. You walk into a local bank there in Albuquerque, a home-owned bank there in Albuquerque, such as Main Bank, and they know who you are. You're not a stranger. You're not just an account number. Same thing here in Farmington or down in Roswell or down in Las Cruces or up in Clayton. We are relationship bankers, and so that's really the biggest difference when it comes down to the ability of our banks to compete with the big guys, as we call them. If it's a deal that's too big for a single bank to handle, Paul, generally what happens is our banks get together. There are agreements between some of our banks around the state where they don't compete in the same market, and they will participate on loans. In other words, they will spread the risk. They will enable that local bank to actually have more lending capability, so that a big deal like that can get done. Whereas a B of A or a U.S. bank or Wells Fargo or whomever, they probably have the strength, the capacity to handle a larger loan on their own. They don't need participations. And so our banks basically, like I say, are relationship driven entities as opposed to just transaction. Now, you ask a question about I'm going to summarize it by saying the business climate in New Mexico as far as being in the banking industry. I think I think in terms of how our banks conduct business, um, number one, our banks do about 60% of the small business lending in New Mexico, and that's true around the nation. We do about 80% of the ag lending around the nation. That may be a little bit less here in New Mexico, but it's going to be in that range. And so our banks do very well on small business lending, as is evidenced by the PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, Paycheck Protection Program that was rolled out last year. Our banks did some 9,500 loans in New Mexico, some about $1.2 billion lent out through the PPP by community banks, as opposed to the roughly 2.4 billion total. And so our banks, we punched above our weight when it came to the PPP. And with round 2.5, I call it, going on right now, again, our banks are punching above their weight. And at this point in time, we're doing just about 50% of the loans that are being done under this latest edition of PPP. And so we do very well, I think, when it comes to competing in the marketplace. Um, is New Mexico necessarily the greatest place in the world to be in business? Well, I think all of us would say there can be improvements made. I can tell you this, that in talking to my counterparts in Texas or Colorado, any of the four states that surround us, and across the country, every state has their pluses and minuses. There are things I would love as a former legislator to change in New Mexico. I went to Santa Fe 40 years ago thinking I could change the world, and figured out real quick that one person can't. But every state has their pluses and their minuses. Some of our pluses, I think, outweigh the minuses, and that's why you still see the private sector in New Mexico doing all they can, all we can, to make a better life for New Mexicans here. But yes, there's challenges in doing business in New Mexico. Maybe state government's a little bit heavy-handed in some respects. The good news for community banks is that most of our regulatory uh, processes and so forth are handed down from the feds, from the FDIC or the OCC or the Federal Reserve. And so very little of what we do actually comes from state regulatory uh, requirements.
Well, a very judicious and politically astute approach to gently critiquing New Mexico's public policy, environment, and economic situation. And again, very admirable. Well, let's turn our attention to what's going on in Santa Fe. To kind of outline the situation, we're halfway or a little more than that at this point through the legislative session. This is, of course, the long 60-day session. We talked to people, and I don't remember if there was any legislation introduced previously, but you definitely been hearing about a public bank and the concept coming to New Mexico. Now, the backers, as far as I know, have really pointed to North Dakota and a public bank that they have there. And they say, well, North Dakota's doing great, New Mexico, not so much. And it's because of their public bank. Now, before we talk about the pros and cons of a public bank, uh, talk about what role, if any, you see a public bank uh, having in New Mexico, and it not filling by yourself and your organization, your banks, or the big mega banks or the credit unions, because it strikes me as odd that we are having this conversation in New Mexico. I don't see a lot of benefits to it, but uh, talk to me about this whole situation.
Sure. Paul, the notion of creating a state or public bank, the conversation's been going on for almost 10 years now. The conversation started in Santa Fe with a couple of lawmakers up there back in an early a session earlier, and uh, and so never really nothing was really done much. And then over the course of 6 or 7 years, 6 or 7 sessions of the legislature, there were a few times when memorials were introduced calling for a study to determine the feasibility of a public bank or a state-owned bank. Uh, we were not favorable toward those studies simply because we saw no need then, we see no need now. Um, and so here we get to 2021, and all of a sudden, instead of having a study, we go straight to a bill introduced by a senator from Las Cruces and by a representative from Albuquerque. Um, and you know, our basic question is why? Uh, what market gap or what failure of the marketplace would require formation of a public bank? Is it good public policy for the state of New Mexico to take money out of the permanent fund and or the general fund and dedicate that money to a public bank? What role would a public bank fill? The proponents are saying, well, it's and we've been kind of we've been humored somewhat during the course of this discussion on a public bank since last summer, when the proponents really started pushing hard. At first, it was going to be a bank that was totally going to work with community banks and credit unions, and they were going to partner with us, and they were going to help us uh, have more money to lend because they were going to pick up part of the loss and so forth. And then they got away from that and decided they were going to go on a different route and do some other things. And then they come back to the participation thing, but all the while claiming that they're going to be a banker's bank, a banker's bank. Banks have to have banks as well. And those banks basically are the entities that clear checks and so forth. When we used to have checks, but there's still entries, electronic entries, so they have to be cleared at night, and so that people's accounts are up to date constantly and so forth. They have to have safekeeping of securities and so forth. There's just a myriad of services that a banker's bank performs, including investing overnight funds that a local bank has to return as much as they can to the investors of that bank, and also in a safe and secure manner. And so they insist that they want to be the banker's bank. The proponents, insist the Public Bank of New Mexico will be a banker's bank. We have 6 banks that serve New Mexico now. We don't need a banker's bank that's ran by the state of New Mexico or owned by the state of New Mexico. You know, when the Public Bank of North Dakota was formed, that's back in 1919. Um, and there was a real need then. There was a real need. Remember, in 1919, did you have electronic banking? No, you did not. Did you even have checks? Well, no. Banks back in that day and time, they were still generating their own currency. There were certificates, bank certificates that were issued, and so you didn't have the Federal Reserve. Well, you had the Federal Reserve, I guess. It was about 6 years old in 1919. The FDIC had not even come into being at that point in time. And the money center banks in Minneapolis and Chicago and New York, they were making it very hard for the farmers, the agricultural industry in Minnesota, to have access to credit, to have access to the payment system, if you will. And so there was a group of folks who captured the state house and the governorship that in that year or the year before, uh, and they decided it was time to create a public bank, and so they did. It's the only one in the nation. There's been about a dozen created since then. All of them had failed. There is one other public bank in the United States now, and it's actually in American Samoa, and it does have access to the Federal Reserve payment window because there is no other way for those folks there to even negotiate the payment system at all. And so the FDIC and the Federal Reserve did allow for some coverage for the Bank of America, American Samoa. But the Bank of North Dakota, Paul, is not FDIC insured. The FDIC, in fact, has a policy that basically prohibits insuring deposits of a public or a state-owned bank. And so that's going to be the first problem that this bank has, and that is putting the full faith and credit of the state of New Mexico at risk on any monies that that quote-unquote bank would hold. Um, and then there's just a myriad of problems. Um, you know, the proponents, and I'm maybe getting off track here and getting too far into the bill at this point. And if I am, stop me and I'll recalibrate. But the proponents are saying, well, you know, the state of New Mexico can charter whatever it wants to. Well, not really. There is a state banking act, and there are steps and procedures and requirements for chartering a state bank in New Mexico, a state chartered bank in the private sector. Those same requirements would apply to a state-owned bank as well. The federal government, the way the bill, House Bill 236 is written, would be the chartering authority according to that bill, which means probably an OCC charter, a federal charter. The OCC has not indicated that they're going to issue any kind of charters like that, nor will the FDIC, like I stated it previously, insure those funds. And finally, the Federal Reserve, again, has some regulations that would make it almost impossible for a public bank of any kind to access the payment window beyond what we currently have, and that's the Bank of North Dakota and American Samoa. So we just don't see a need. We don't
So
see
Jerry, what are those are all great points. I mean, you really hit a lot of big issues that I would see with a state bank. But, you know, kind of as the taxpayer perspective here, what about the cost and the potential for corruption and failure? Because, you know, all states have their issues, as you said, but New Mexico, I think, has some deeper seated issues in terms of political corruption, you know, the lack of accountability of government. And I'm not saying North Dakota's got everything on the ball, but boy, I think we've seen this rodeo here in New Mexico a few times. But more importantly, where's the money going to come from? You need someone's money to lend it out in the first place. And you know, I guess as a final question, the political situation seems to be ripe for abuse as well, because, you know, we have left-wing politicians, and yes, especially in New Mexico, where we're a Democrat-controlled state, you don't have tobacco, for example, or even oil and gas or coal or whoever, whatever industry that is unpopular at the given moment, those folks tend to be excluded in terms of pension systems and whatnot. So talk about some of those kinds of nuts and bolts issues as well.
Sure. Paul, the House Bill 236 calls for the bank to be capitalized with $100 million of taxpayer dollars. $50 million of that would come from the state treasurer's office. Those are general fund monies, and they would be put into the state bank, the public bank. The other $50 million would come from the severance tax permanent fund. And in fact, the investment officer, the state investment officer's FIR, fiscal impact report, questions whether or not it could be considered an investment because of the unlikelihood, not likelihood, unlikelihood that this entity, this bank, they're calling it, would even be able to return a profit. We have looked at the projections that have been put forth by the proponents of the House Bill 236. They claim they're going to leverage that $100 million 10 times and be making a profit in year one. For those of us who've been in the private sector most of our lives, we know full well that it's very, very, very rare that a startup business is going to make a profit in the first year. In fact, if you look at the financial side of this, so you're going to invest $100 million. The Legislative Finance Committee, in their fiscal impact report, shows the bank would lose at least $480,000, pardon me, in the first year, $968,000 in the second year, and almost $1.5 million in the third year of its existence. And so we question the numbers and the claim that this thing is going to be profitable. Secondly, you know, I think it's very important to realize that the way this bill is drafted, the legislature would have the authority. In fact, it would be required that the legislature set the budget for and appropriate the budget for this public bank, which in my mind makes it nothing more than just another state agency, especially if there's no charter, no bank charter, there's no deposit insurance, it's not a typical bank. And that's not even a typical banker's bank. And so in our estimation, it's really nothing more than just a new state agency, which is going to compete with a myriad of agencies now that do some of the things that these folks are claiming this bank would do in terms of financing public projects at the low market rates and so forth. You bring up the idea or the subject of the possibly political influence with this bank. Well, that's very real. Take a look at the bill. You'll see that 4 members of the board of directors of this public bank would be appointed by the New Mexico Legislative Council. That's a committee of leadership on both sides of the aisle, both houses. The council would appoint 4 members to this board. 4 members would be appointed by the governor. The chief executive officer of the New Mexico Finance Authority would be a member. The state treasurer would be a member. And then the secretary of economic development would be a member. Those are all fine people. The last 3 that I just mentioned, the ones who would be appointed, I'm sure are fine people too. But you know, when you're being appointed by political fiat, if you will, there is room for political influence. In talking to my counterparts around the country, and then my counterpart in North Dakota, even though that bank has a good history up there, they have to deal with political influence every year. Somebody getting the grand idea, let's do this with the profits from this bank, and here they go running with a bill in the legislature trying to direct money instead of allowing the board up there to make those decisions. So you're right, that's going to happen in New Mexico. There's just no way around it. And finally, as far as the financial side of this again is concerned, you know, our severance tax permanent fund, you know, it is the goose. It is the goose. Oil and gas is the goose. The golden egg is the permanent severance tax permanent fund, and we've enjoyed that for many years. And so when you start diverting monies out of the investments that the State Investment Council makes through with those funds, you're going to be costing the state money. I think I saw a number where there's something of an average of 6.5% right now being returned on the investments from the by the investment officer of the State Investment Council. If this $50 million is going to be in jeopardy from day one, and the bank losing money from day one, then that just tells me that the taxpayers in New Mexico are going to be on the hook to have to recapitalize that bank at some point in time. And when that starts, where do we stop? Where do we stop? At this point, they're saying there's just going to be state monies that are going to be put into the bank. But there are state monies that are on deposit locally with community banks all over New Mexico. So are those state monies eventually going to be tapped and brought to Santa Fe as a mandate so that the state bank will have plenty of money as far as deposits? If so, then that's going to cause a real rip in the marketplace. And I think local officials, especially local finance officials, not state monies, but local monies, taxpayer monies, I think there would be a hue and cry like you've never heard, because our local officials are used to dealing with local bankers, and they know what to expect. And they know the money is safe and secure. It would not be in the state bank.
So Jerry, when we're talking about banking, it's also related to, if you will, seed money and venture capital. I know it's not exactly the same thing, but a lot of people in our state who, want us, and I think, I want us, and presumably you want us as a state to be a destination for more businesses that are getting off the ground, that are creating the next big thing, that we see those entrepreneurs and folks working out of their garages, but moving to other states. Is there some aspect of this plan that would supposedly, or is it kind of a sub goal of it to provide that kind of in-state venture capital that we supposedly don't have, that we need to get these businesses set up and running here in New Mexico, so we become kind of the new tech hub? Or does this have nothing to do with that?
I know that the proponents would like to say that that is one of their goals. Um, they have made reference publicly and in writing and in testimony before committees that they're going to help the banks make those loans that the banks can't make now. Um, the only problem with that statement is that if it's a loan that the regulators would not allow the bank to make now, or if it's a loan that the board of directors who actually own that bank or have stock in that bank, and it's their money that's at risk, it's not anyone else's money as far as the stock is concerned. Of course, the depositor's money is at risk if you start getting too deep into this. But if they're not willing to put their money into a project, a loan, then why should the state of New Mexico? If it's too risky for the private sector to do, it should be too risky for the state dollars to do. Now, yes, you're correct. When you form a bank, when you create a bank, you have to have investors, you have to have stockholders. Um, and it's not, a bank is not created simply for the good of all. It's created as a profit making entity that pays taxes, it hires people, it does a lot of things. I mean, you go to your local grocery store and see if you don't see your community banker shopping there just like you do. Who do they go to when they're asking for uniforms for the little league or for the cheerleaders or the band? Who are they going to whenever they're asking for scoreboards at football fields and so forth? They're going to the community banks. They're going to the private sector mostly, asking for contributions. This bank would not be allowed to do that, again, because of legal constraints and I think operational money constraints. So that's Paul, that's part of this. Um, there has to be reward for what you do. There has to be uh, the desire on the part of the people who are running banks to make a profit. If there's no profit motive, then what do you really have? You have another another government giveaway program, and that's what we're fearful of with this. So I don't know that I've answered your question in the best manner, but you're
Well,
hearing from us some of our concerns.
well, I think you generally hit upon it, and you made a great point about, the profit motive. And I think that's definitely something that a lot of members of our legislature, a lot of folks around our state don't understand, don't care about, and quite frankly, would prefer just to dispense with entirely. It's one of the problems of this being such a government-driven state. But I guess as another means of asking that question, but in a different direction, uh, it's a related topic that the advocates will say, we don't keep the money in New Mexico when it goes into the current banking structure. Now, I, you know, I think it's interesting, and it'd be an interesting exercise. And I'd like to ask you this question: How does the money move around once you go to the teller window at your local bank? And we'll start with yours, but and if you have an understanding of how the major Bank of America's work, et cetera, what happens to the money when it's deposited? Where does it go? what kind of investments are made? Is there a major difference between your members and the big banks? And kind of walk us through all that, because I think, banking is certainly something that a lot of folks on all sides of the political spectrum have a lot of curiosity and concern about. And it goes back a long way in this country.
Well, and I think I stated earlier, one of the reasons that the community banks in New Mexico fought so hard against interstate banking was exactly that. We did not want to see the large banks come in, establish a beachhead, if you would, and um, and then collect deposits to be used where they're needed more out of state. So that does happen. But a simple. Let's take the city of Farmington or San Juan County or Bernalillo County. So they're banking with their local bank, at least partially. They're depositing money with a local bank. Those deposits stay in the community. Now, does the bank have an investment portfolio then where they're investing in overnights and so forth to obtain the greatest return on the deposits
What's an overnight, before I let you go on? What
that's,
are you
that's
talking about overnight?
okay. That's an overnight investment that is controlled by um, either a banker's bank or through the bond market or through another agency such as the Federal Reserve or something or and so banks will take their excess funds and they will invest those overnight. That's why the return and then the money's back in the bank the next day. It never leaves the bank, but the accounting process, and so it's utilized in the market, and so uh, they invest those monies overnight, and then they use the profits off of that to keep the bank running and to make a profit and to have more funds to lend out. In terms of every bank in New Mexico, whether it be a state chartered bank or a national chartered bank, there is a lending limit as to how much a bank can lend before onto an individual customer before it is considered to be too heavy of a concentration to that particular customer. And so banks have to watch that. And so um, it's a very technical business in a lot of ways, Paul. And that's another thing that not scares us, but is aware we're aware of, and that is the infrastructure that would be required for just the $100 million that they're talking about. But you take a look at what happens with the state treasurer's office or the SIC, the State Investment Council, and the investments that they make. Again, the state treasurer uh, does overnight investments and tries to make as much for the taxpayers with their money as he can. Um, but just the infrastructure for doing that, it is so complicated. This state agency they're going to call a state bank would have none of that. Would have none of that. They're talking about having a president and somebody to be the compliance officer and the chief credit officer or something in the bill. Uh, that wouldn't even hardly get the doors open, quite honestly, because there's so much more to a bank than that. And so I hope I've answered your question. I kind of get off and go down rabbit holes occasionally, as you've noticed, I'm sure, because it is it's such a huge issue, and you could talk about this for the next 3 days and come up with more questions.
No, no, you're doing a great job in answering a lot of questions and providing a lot of great context. I guess what I'm, and you did allude to it at the beginning, talking about the interstate banking issue, and uh, you know, it's a delicate situation. I think there's a lot of arguments to be made regarding that whole process. But in terms of the state bank issue, I guess, you know, this bank would be beholden, if you will, to New Mexico uh, lending. It wouldn't be out there competing across state lines. You would somehow have to be located or benefiting New Mexico in some way. And I guess I'm kind of confused as to uh, how they would make those decisions, because especially on the business side, you've got a lot of different people in a lot of different stakeholders that are working to create business and economic growth in a particular place. And it just strikes me as it's going to get very difficult for a state bank to support New Mexico in a way that the proponents of this claim that's going to happen as a result of having the state bank. It just seems very complicated because money flows very quickly, especially nowadays. Maybe not in the 70s and the 60s, but it's a very rapid, press of a button kind of thing these days.
Paul, maybe I can stay out of the rabbit hole for a minute and give you kind of a more simple example of some of the things we see that are troubling. Currently, we have the New Mexico Finance Authority, which basically is the bonding agent, if you will, for local communities and state agencies to go to the marketplace by pooling bonds together and going to the marketplace and selling those bonds, those tax exempt bonds, and getting a preferred rate. The proponents of this bill want this public bank to be that entity. And so, in other words, they want to displace the New Mexico Finance Authority with what they've been doing successfully since that agency was created and got off the ground 2 or 3 decades ago, and has done a good job. Their bonds, incidentally, are rated AAA. Today, because of the lack of FDIC insurance or security on the deposits of the public bank, their bonds would probably be rated just A or a minus A, simply because of the unknown of this bank. And what that translates to is a higher percentage rate that you pay on bonds. The lesser the rating for a bond, the higher the cost to borrow the money. That's what you're doing. You're bonding against a loan. And so they're wanting to displace New Mexico Finance Authority and do these public projects because they say they can use state money to do that and not send the money out of state to the market. Um, and that is just so incredibly wrong. There has to be, again, with the state severance tax permanent fund and the land grant permanent fund and the other funds that we have, there's a requirement that those funds be operated in a manner that's going to meet the prudent man rule, if you will, prudent investor rule, and return the highest rates safely to the taxpayers, to the corpus of the fund, as can be done. Uh, if in fact they're going to use, they think they're going to use the state money and just pull it out and then wait for what, 20 years, 30 years for a bond issue to be paid off before the funds come back into the coffers of the permanent fund or the land grant permanent fund or whatever. So they're going to have to go to the market. That's the bottom line. When they go to the market, they're doing the same thing that the Finance Authority is doing. They're doing the same thing that the large banks do. They go to the market with bonds. They do that. They do be doing the same thing that some of the larger community banks do as well, and that is going to the market to obtain funding, capital, to lend out. And so maybe I hope that helps a little bit. Uh, there's so much duplication in what the proponents want to say they want to do with a public bank, yet the need for it, the public policy question just isn't there. I think someone said in the hearing the other night that this was a solution looking for a problem, and we see it that way. The private sector, the private market, the free market system has done well in New Mexico in terms of serving the taxpayers. And remember, anytime you take anything away from the private sector, you are affecting tax income back to the state. And so not only are they going to be putting public funds at risk, they're going to be reducing the amount of taxes collected by the state to fund all these agencies in the first place. You know, we recognize that there is quite an attack going on the extractive industries in New Mexico. We think that is horribly bad. And you asked a question earlier, if we're involved in oil and gas. Well, no, I don't think our banks are necessarily involved in financing oil and gas projects, but all those service companies that do support that industry, you know, my goodness, our banks do. In fact, they do, in fact, finance those. They bank them, if you will. And so there's a real snowball effect when you start down this path. Our friends at the credit unions, which generally we get along with those folks. We do have an issue that they are not taxed. They are a tax-free entity at the federal and state level. So we have a problem with that. But they're supporting, the association itself is supporting the creation of a state bank because they believe this is going to put more funds on deposit with credit unions and allow them to get more into the business lending side of running their credit unions. We think we just think that they don't understand what they're saying. Maybe they do, maybe we don't understand, but we feel like they're pulling more money out of the private sector that tax-paying entities would be using and paying taxes on as a result, and putting it into non-tax-paying entities that at some point, where does the budget come from? Where does the money for the budget come from? If
All
you
right.
shoot oil and gas in the head, you shoot coal and uranium in the head, you shoot community banks in the head. I mean, when are we going to start creating a state insurance, independent insurance
Don't
agents?
give them any ideas, Jerry. All right, we're sorry, we're going to have to wrap things up there. I think that is an excellent way to conclude because you're asking questions that we ask regularly here at the Rio Grande Foundation. All right, Jerry Walker, what can people, aside from sending their legislators a message on HB 236, and it did pass its first committee. So, I mean, I don't know that this is a true, this is going to pass this session, but that's the way these things work on the left. They're going to get the early childhood programs and tapping the permanent fund that they've wanted so bad. It took them a decade or more to do that. This is going to be an issue they bring up again and again and again. But how do people find out, real briefly, who your members are if they want to change their banking to an independent community banker here in New Mexico? How do they find out about those folks?
Well, thank you for even doing that. I wasn't aware you would do that. We appreciate that. You can go to our website, www.icbanm.org. And on there, you'll look down, there's some tabs along on the homepage there, and you'll see a tab for members. And you can click on that tab, and there's actually a place there where you can find a local community bank on our website. We also have a listing of all of our banks there in New Mexico that are members of our association. And there's also a listing, of course, or a way to look at nationally for community banks across the nation. But Paul, thank you. I appreciate that plug. And we encourage your listeners and our friends and neighbors to do call your local legislator, your senator, or your representative, and let them know that maybe they need to put this one to the side for a few years and concentrate on just making New Mexico the best private sector business-friendly state that we can.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnewmexico.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, and have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.